The moment Romy Reiner walked into the guest house that Sunday morning, nothing could have prepared her for what she would find. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed the silence, the unnerving stillness that felt heavier than any winter morning should. Her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, were supposed to be alive, vibrant, hosting brunch, laughing at a joke only they could understand. But instead, the world she knew came to a brutal, heart-stopping halt. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What Romy discovered would not only shatter her life, but ignite one of the most shocking family tragedies the nation had seen in decades. And at the center of it all was a person she had grown up with, someone she had trusted without question, her brother, Nick Reiner. Have you ever asked yourself how well you really know the people you love? How could someone who shared your childhood, your family dinners, your vacations, suddenly become the orchestrator of unspeakable violence? That's the question millions are grappling with today, as the story of the Reiner family unfolds. This isn't just a tale of murder. It's a story of betrayal, hidden motives, and shocking admissions that no one saw coming. Until the day Nick finally admitted what we all suspected. The Reiners' estate in Brentwood, a sprawling $13.5 million mansion, should have been a sanctuary. Lush gardens, marble floors, and walls adorned with family photographs painted the picture of a perfect life. But perfect lives often hide perfect storms. In the guest house, Nick had lived relatively quietly, keeping to himself. Neighbors described him as polite, almost invisible, blending into the background. But beneath that calm exterior lay tension, unspoken grudges, and perhaps a plan that would devastate everyone around him. The first reports that reached the public were chilling in their simplicity. Rob Reiner, 78, beloved for his decades in film and television, and Michelle Reiner, 70, cherished by friends and family alike, were found stabbed to death. Authorities quickly ruled the deaths a homicide, citing multiple sharp force injuries. The date of death was confirmed as Sunday, December 14th, a detail that cut through weeks of speculation and rumors. And as investigators pieced together the timeline, one fact became increasingly clear. The crime had been intimate, deliberate, and horrifyingly personal. Romy Reiner, 27, the daughter of the couple and sister to Nick, was the first to alert authorities. She had called the police, her voice trembling as she recounted seeing something in the guest house that she couldn't unsee. In her statement, she mentioned a dangerous family member, someone who should have been a suspect from the very start. It was a cryptic warning, but one that investigators would soon learn was both literal and damning. Imagine having to confront the idea that a brother, someone you shared holidays and birthdays with, could be capable of such violence. The shock is unbearable, almost unfathomable, yet here it was. As the news hit, the world watched in disbelief. Social media exploded with speculation, theory, and heartbreak. Commentators recounted Rob Reiner's celebrated career, highlighting his contributions to film, his advocacy, and the warmth he exuded off-screen. Michelle's philanthropic work, her dedication to family, and her quiet elegance were praised. And yet, beneath the headlines and accolades lay a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. A family's private nightmare had spilled into public consciousness, leaving everyone questioning not just what happened, but why it happened. So what drove Nick Reiner to this point? Some suggested financial tension, perhaps an inheritance dispute or disagreements about control of family assets. Others speculated that months of personal grudges, compounded by isolation in the guest house, had festered into something deadly. The reality was more complex. Behind the polished doors of the Brentwood estate lay a labyrinth of emotion, resentment, secrecy, and unresolved conflict. It was the perfect environment for tragedy to take root. Investigators meticulously combed the mansion for evidence. Every fingerprint, every stray text message, every financial record became a piece of a larger puzzle. Early reports indicated that Nick had been living in the guest house at the time of the murders, placing him at the scene when the unthinkable occurred. The authorities acted swiftly, apprehending him that very night. Arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, Nick became the central figure in a narrative that would dominate headlines for months to come. But even in arrest, the question lingered. What had driven him to commit such a heinous act against his own parents? While the public grappled with shock and grief, Romy Reiner faced the unimaginable task of processing both her parents' deaths and the betrayal of her brother. Imagine the conflicting emotions: grief, disbelief, anger, confusion. How does one mourn while also grappling with the fact that the person who destroyed your family could be sitting in a holding cell, fully aware of the devastation he caused? The emotional weight is almost unbearable. And yet, Romy's courage in speaking to authorities provided the first real threads of clarity in an otherwise murky and terrifying situation. One of the most unsettling aspects of this tragedy is the intimate nature of the crime. Sharp force injuries are not random. They are deliberate, precise, and personal. The act itself suggests more than anger. It suggests planning, a coldness that is difficult to comprehend. To understand the magnitude of this, think about the person you trust most in the world, someone whose well-being you care for deeply, being targeted in such a brutal way. That is the reality Romy and the Reiner family were forced to confront, a reality that no amount of fame, wealth, or privilege could shield them from. And yet, even as details emerged, there was a lingering question that haunted everyone involved. Was this act entirely of Nick's own volition, or had circumstances, pressures, and hidden family dynamics pushed him over the edge? Investigators and legal analysts speculated about the possibility of secret pacts, undisclosed financial tensions, or family agreements gone awry. Every detail, no matter how small, a misfiled bank statement, a mysterious text, a long-forgotten argument, could be a critical piece of the puzzle. The tension built as the public waited for Nick to finally speak, to reveal the truth behind the horrifying events of that December Sunday. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear. This was a story not just about murder, but about the complexity of family dynamics. Wealth, status, and public perception could not shield the Reiners from internal conflict. The tragedy forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, loyalty, and the dark corners of human emotion. And it was precisely that darkness, that hidden side of Nick Reiner, that the world had been both unaware of and increasingly curious about. By the time Nick entered the courtroom and prepared to make his first formal statements, anticipation had reached a fever pitch. What would he admit? Would it match the suspicions that had been circulating since the night of the murders? Or would there be a shocking twist, a revelation that no one could have predicted? The emotional stakes were higher than any headline could convey, and the gravity of the situation weighed on everyone involved. Families, neighbors, and fans alike were forced to confront the horrifying reality. Sometimes the monsters closest to us are people we once loved. And so, as we prepare to delve deeper into the events leading up to that fateful Sunday, the investigation, the shocking revelations, and the eventual confession, we must ask ourselves the questions that no one could ignore. How did a family tragedy of this magnitude go unnoticed until it exploded into the headlines? What were the warning signs, the secrets, and the subtle cues that hinted at what Nick Reiner would finally admit? And ultimately, how does one reconcile grief with betrayal when the perpetrator is family? What would you do if, in a single moment, your entire world flipped upside down? Imagine walking into a place you've always called home and realizing nothing will ever be the same again. For Romy Reiner, that moment came on a cold Sunday morning, December 14th. The kind of morning that seems ordinary at first, birds chirping, the faint smell of coffee in the air, but which, within minutes, would be forever marked by horror. Romy had always been close to her parents. Rob, 78, larger than life, charming, a figure who exuded both authority and warmth. Michelle, 70, gentle but firm, the glue of the family, whose voice could soothe even the sharpest disagreements. And Nick, 32, the sibling she had grown up alongside. Her brother, her confidant in childhood, but a person whose true nature was yet to fully reveal itself. That morning, Romy had gone to the guest house to check on her brother, as she often did. She wanted to make sure he was up early, ready for the day. But what she found shattered every expectation. The door to the guest house was slightly ajar. That, in itself, was odd. Nick usually kept it locked, a small detail she had never given much thought to, until that moment. A sense of unease crept up her spine as she pushed it open. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a heavy, suffocating quiet. A quiet that demanded attention. Her heart raced. She called out his name, her voice trembling. "Nick? Are you there?" No answer. Then she saw it. The scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Rob and Michelle Reiner, lifeless on the floor. The sight froze her, yet at the same time, a strange, almost robotic part of her mind began to catalog the details, the positions of their bodies, the unmistakable signs of struggle, the subtle but horrifying evidence of multiple sharp force injuries. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. How do you process that moment when the person you trusted most, your own brother, is at the center of the storm? Romy didn't have time to understand. Panic surged. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking, dialed 911. Her words spilled out, frantic, disjointed. "It's my parents, something's happened. Please, someone come quickly." She repeated it, over and over, as if saying it aloud could make it untrue. But it wasn't untrue. The police arrived within minutes, a blur of uniforms and flashing lights. Neighbors had called as well, responding to the sound of Romy's screams echoing through the normally serene streets of Brentwood. Detectives swept the guest house, their faces grim, their eyes trained for every detail, every anomaly. They documented the scene meticulously, photographs, fingerprints, blood spatter patterns. The room told a story of sudden violence, but also one of calculation. Every detail mattered. Every detail would point to someone they already suspected. Romy watched silently, tears streaming, her mind struggling to process what she saw. She was in shock, grief colliding with a creeping, cold fear. Her brother Nick, who she had known since birth, was living in the guest house at the time. And suddenly, the realization struck her like lightning. The person closest to this crime might be the person she had grown up with, the person she had called her brother. What makes a person capable of such acts? How can someone turn on their own family? For weeks, the public would ask these questions. Psychologists would weigh in. Detectives would speculate. But for Romy, it wasn't speculation. It was lived experience, raw and unfiltered. She remembered the small moments. Nick's temper, his withdrawn moods, the subtle ways he sometimes resented the attention their parents gave her, the quiet ways he expressed frustration. She had noticed them before, yes, but she had dismissed them, rationalized them. She had never imagined they would escalate to murder. As the initial investigation progressed, authorities began piecing together the timeline. Rob and Michelle were pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death, multiple sharp force injuries, each one deliberate, each one a devastating act of violence. The manner of death, homicide. The investigators would later reveal that the attack likely occurred in the early morning hours before Romy discovered the scene. That meant Nick had been alone with them at the time, a fact that deepened the chilling reality of the situation. Neighbors, family friends, and extended family were interviewed. Many described Nick as quiet, almost unremarkable, blending into the background. But subtle tensions were hinted at. Small quarrels over money, disagreements over inheritance, resentment over perceived favoritism. Details that, in retrospect, painted a much darker picture. What the public saw was a normal family, wealthy, successful, respected. What the investigators saw was a family riven with undercurrents of resentment and hidden conflicts that had escalated into deadly action. Romy's own testimony became a critical piece of the puzzle. She told police about a dangerous family member, a phrase that seemed cryptic at the time but would later become chillingly literal. Detectives pored over her account, cross-referencing it with forensic evidence, surveillance footage, and digital records. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, a narrative that pointed directly to Nick. Every text message he had sent, every unexplained absence, every late-night withdrawal from the family bank accounts, pieces of the puzzle started aligning. As the investigation continued, questions arose about motive. Was this purely financial? Was there deep-seated anger or resentment that had finally boiled over? Or was it something else, something darker that only Nick himself could explain? Public speculation ran wild, with social media and news outlets dissecting every known detail. But even with all the theories circulating, one fact remained unassailable. Nick was the prime suspect, and his connection to the victims made the crime even more unfathomable. And yet, amid the horror, There were moments of human emotion that pierced the darkness. Romy's courage, for instance, in coming forward, in facing investigators with the truth, even when it implicated her own brother, was remarkable. It highlighted the complex emotions that exist in families, where love, loyalty, fear, and grief collide. How do you protect the memory of your parents while confronting the reality that your sibling may have taken their lives? It's a question that would haunt her, and the public, forever. By the time the authorities apprehended Nick that night, the world had begun to realize the gravity of what had happened. First-degree murder charges were filed. The public, shocked, struggled to reconcile the image of a calm, almost invisible son with the brutality of the act he was accused of committing. Headlines screamed, debates erupted on television panels, and the Reiner family's private tragedy became a national conversation. What happened in that guest house that morning would set the stage for months of shocking revelations, courtroom drama, and ultimately, the confession that would stun everyone. But even now, in the immediate aftermath, the questions were overwhelming. What drove Nick to such a horrific act? Could it have been prevented? Were there warning signs that everyone had missed? And most pressing of all, how does a family move forward when the very person they loved most has betrayed them in the most unimaginable way? The investigation was only beginning. Forensic experts were combing through the estate, searching for any overlooked detail that could provide clarity. Psychologists and behavioral analysts were called in to assess Nick's mental state. Friends and neighbors were questioned, trying to reconstruct his behavior in the days leading up to the murders. Every layer peeled back revealed not just violence, but secrecy, resentment, and a darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect family life. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, Romy's mind kept returning to one question. Had she really known her brother at all? Had anyone? The person accused of the unthinkable was someone she had shared meals with, celebrated birthdays with, confided in, and loved. Could all of that coexist with the brutality she had witnessed? The answer seemed impossible, yet there it was, a reality she could neither deny nor escape. But what Romy and the investigators didn't yet know was that the events of that morning were only the beginning. There were secrets still hidden in plain sight. Messages, transactions, and interactions that would soon reveal the full scope of what had driven Nick Reiner to finally admit what the world had suspected all along. And when that confession came, it would not just answer questions. It would open an entirely new set of shocking revelations, each more startling than the last. Who could have done this? It was the question that everyone asked, yet no one wanted to hear the answer. In the immediate hours after Romy discovered her parents' bodies, police began piecing together a picture that was both horrifying and strangely familiar. The suspects weren't strangers, weren't intruders from the outside, they were family. And in cases like these, the truth is almost too terrible to face. The people closest to us can sometimes harbor the darkest intentions. Detectives moved quickly. They cordoned off the $13.5 million Brentwood estate, ensuring no one entered or left without scrutiny. Forensic teams combed through every room, every closet, every corner of the mansion and the guest house. Blood spatter analysis revealed the pattern of the attack, multiple sharp force injuries delivered with calculated precision. The nature of the wounds told a story of familiarity, of someone who knew exactly where and how to strike. Random violence doesn't leave patterns like these. Neighbors and family friends were interviewed. At first, everyone was incredulous. Nick? Our Nick? They asked. It just doesn't make sense. Nick had always been quiet, reserved, and polite. He had a low profile, never raising eyebrows. But as the detectives delved deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Accounts of his behavior, subtle changes in mood, moments of withdrawal, things that might have seemed insignificant in isolation, suddenly formed a troubling mosaic. Romy herself became a key witness, recounting moments that had previously seemed unremarkable. He had been acting strange for weeks, she told authorities. I didn't know why at the time. I thought it was stress, maybe loneliness. But looking back, I realized there were warning signs. Her words were chilling because they revealed a reality that many families ignore. The warning signs are often there, but they're masked by love, familiarity, and hope that things will improve. At the same time, The police began analyzing communication records, texts, emails, and social media messages. Small arguments about money, unreturned calls, unexplained trips, and financial withdrawals. All of it became pieces of a puzzle. And while these clues didn't yet reveal motive, they suggested simmering tensions that could explode at any moment. Investigators asked themselves, had someone in the family been pushed too far? Or had the violence been premeditated, an outcome of years of hidden resentment? The public watched closely, drawn to the case like moths to a flame. Headlines splashed across news websites. Brentwood tragedy, son arrested in parents' murders, family secrets, and sudden violence. Who could commit such an act? Social media erupted, with everyone speculating about the Reiner family dynamics. Yet, the true story remained locked behind police barricades and legal confidentiality. The mystery kept viewers hooked, each new report adding another layer of suspense. Meanwhile, the detectives focused on one inescapable fact. Nick Reiner was present at the estate. He lived in the guest house, giving him proximity and opportunity. The timeline placed him there during the early hours of the morning, coinciding with the murders. But even proximity alone wasn't enough to secure a conviction. The investigation required corroborating evidence, motives, and behavioral analysis to connect the dots. Interviews with extended family revealed tensions that, while common in many families, now seemed ominous. Discussions over inheritance, parental favoritism, and perceived slights were more than just idle grievances. They were fuel for resentment. One relative admitted, Nick always felt overlooked. He never expressed it openly, but there was always a simmering frustration. Was this frustration enough to drive someone to commit murder? Investigators had to explore every angle. Detectives also revisited Romy's statement about a dangerous family member. Initially, it was cryptic, almost vague, but its meaning became horrifyingly clear as they dug deeper. Every interview, every record, every behavioral observation pointed to Nick. He was not just a suspect. He was the person whose actions demanded explanation. And yet, even as evidence mounted, questions lingered. What could push a son to turn against his parents in such a violent, final way? As investigators probed Nick's recent behavior, a pattern of isolation emerged. He had distanced himself from friends and social circles. He rarely participated in family events, preferring solitude in the guest house. While this might seem innocuous to outsiders, combined with financial disputes and minor conflicts with his parents, it painted a picture of a young man increasingly disconnected from the family unit. And when combined with the brutality of the crime, it suggested a level of planning that was chilling. The community was stunned. Brentwood is an area known for privacy, discretion, and high-profile residents. Yet this event laid bare the dark undercurrents hidden behind polished facades. People whispered, trying to reconcile the image of the Reiner family, the famous father, the accomplished mother, the seemingly quiet son, with the reality of murder, betrayal, and suspicion. Could a family with wealth and public respect really harbor such a violent secret? Meanwhile, investigators found themselves tracing financial records and transactions. There were unusual withdrawals, transfers between accounts, and purchases that, while seemingly mundane, now carried sinister implications. Could financial stress or greed have been a motivator? Were there disputes over inheritance or family assets that pushed Nick over the edge? These questions became central to understanding not just the act, but the reasoning behind it. Media scrutiny intensified. Reporters dug into past interviews, public appearances, and online presence. They highlighted every discrepancy, every unusual behavior. Every small detail became fodder for speculation. And yet, despite the media frenzy, the investigation remained meticulous. Authorities couldn't act on conjecture. They needed proof, corroboration, and statements that would stand up in court. Psychological experts began weighing in, analyzing Nick's behavior in the context of family violence. They discussed possible triggers, unresolved parental conflicts, perceived favoritism toward Romy, social isolation, and financial disputes. While these factors could never justify murder, they helped explain the escalation of tension within the household. Experts suggested that people often overlook warning signs, rationalizing strange behavior as temporary mood swings or normal adolescent-like rebellion. In Nick's case, The warning signs had been missed until it was tragically too late. And yet, as investigators and experts worked tirelessly, a persistent question haunted everyone. Had there been a chance to prevent this tragedy? Could someone have recognized the warning signs, intervened, or sought help? For Romy, these questions were impossible to answer fully. Grief was compounded by guilt. She had loved her brother and hoped for the best, even as the undercurrents of resentment and secrecy swirled beneath the surface. Then came the first pieces of corroborating evidence. Fingerprints in the guest house, security footage that showed Nick's movements, and text messages that hinted at anger and frustration. Each new piece tightened the noose of suspicion. Authorities began connecting these details, building a narrative that painted a clear, yet horrifying, picture. The person who seemed most unassuming was at the center of the crime. And as this evidence accumulated, the inevitability of a confession loomed larger with each passing day. By the end of the first 48 hours, law enforcement had enough to justify arresting Nick. The procedure was precise, swift, and handled with discretion. Neighbors watched in disbelief as a young man, previously quiet and reserved, was escorted from the estate in handcuffs. The gravity of the moment was palpable. Headlines would later report, Nick Reiner arrested in parents' murders. But for those who knew the family, the impact went far deeper than newsprint. Public opinion was divided. Some struggled to comprehend how a son could commit such an act. Others speculated about underlying motives, from financial disputes to hidden psychological issues. Social media became a forum for wild theories, debates, and speculation. Every new detail sparked heated discussion. Yet, the truth, the real story behind the tragedy, was still waiting to emerge, hidden behind evidence, legal proceedings, and, most critically, Nick's eventual confession. And while law enforcement and the public processed these shocking developments, Romy faced the impossible task of confronting her grief. She was left navigating the devastation of losing both parents in a single, violent act, while also grappling with the reality that the person responsible was her brother. She questioned everything she had known, every childhood memory, every interaction. How could someone so familiar commit an act so alien, so unimaginable? But as the investigation deepened, and as authorities pieced together the chain of events leading to that horrific morning, a chilling realization emerged. The tragedy was more than the culmination of anger or frustration. It was the result of secrets, tension, and patterns of behavior that had been hidden in plain sight for years. And soon, these hidden truths would come to light, as Nick Reiner began to confront the reality of his actions, a confrontation that would leave the world stunned. Have you ever thought you knew someone completely, only to discover that their entire life had been a carefully crafted illusion? That's exactly what investigators, and the public, began to realize about Nick Reiner. To the world, he was a quiet, polite young man living in the guest house of his family's $13.5 million Brentwood estate. But behind the calm exterior, there was a private life filled with contradictions, secrecy, and behaviors that painted a very different picture than anyone had expected. Nick's friends and acquaintances described him as reserved, sometimes shy, almost invisible. He attended events, smiled, exchanged pleasantries, but rarely let anyone in. There were no wild nights, no scandalous rumors, at least not publicly. But investigators soon learned that appearances can be deceiving. People often wear masks, hiding the parts of themselves they don't want others to see. And for Nick, the mask was flawless. At first, authorities focused on what could be seen: Nick's daily habits, routines, and interactions with family. He would leave the guest house early, sometimes for hours, returning without explanation. Sometimes he appeared anxious, jittery even, though it was difficult to say why. What had investigators missed, initially, was the depth of the hidden life he had built. Financial maneuvers, secret communications, and private grudges that were invisible to all but him. It began with his finances. Nick had access to certain family accounts, which he managed quietly, sometimes making transfers or withdrawals without oversight. On the surface, these were small and innocuous. But as forensic accountants dug deeper, patterns emerged. Unexplained withdrawals, last-minute payments, and transactions that didn't make sense began to paint a picture of a man managing more than just his daily expenses. There were hints of secret dealings, attempts to establish independence, and, as investigators would later suggest, possible preparations for something darker. Then there were the communications. Text messages, emails, and social media activity revealed a man who was constantly calculating, constantly measuring his interactions and relationships. Some messages indicated anger, frustration, or resentment toward his parents, small complaints that, in retrospect, foreshadowed the tragedy to come. Other messages hinted at secrecy and manipulation, though without direct evidence of wrongdoing. They were difficult to interpret, yet investigators sensed a pattern. Nick was living in a world separate from the one his family perceived. Even within the home, there were signs that Nick's private life was distinct from his public persona. The guest house, once a place of comfort, became an isolated retreat. Neighbors noticed he spent long hours alone, rarely engaging with anyone outside the immediate family. He kept the windows covered, lights dimmed, and was unusually meticulous about security. Some described it as obsessive. Others said it was simply cautious. But when combined with the murder investigation, the behavior began to take on a much more sinister connotation. Investigators also examined Nick's social relationships. He had few close friends, and many acquaintances described him as polite but distant. On social media, he maintained a minimal presence, carefully curating what others could see. There were no public conflicts, no evidence of violent tendencies. Yet those who had brief glimpses into his life described contradictions, moments of intense frustration, subtle manipulation, and occasional secrecy that seemed unnecessary for someone so young and ostensibly ordinary. Family dynamics added another layer of complexity. Nick had long-standing issues with his parents. Romy had recalled small incidents over the years. Arguments about favoritism, minor disagreements that seemed blown out of proportion, and subtle resentments that he never voiced fully. While these conflicts were common in many families, combined with his private behaviors, they created a foundation for tension that, investigators now realized, had been building quietly for years. Neighbors began to share observations that, at first glance, seemed trivial. Nick would sometimes take late-night walks, returning at odd hours. He had minor disputes with delivery personnel and maintenance staff, which he handled with unexpected intensity. These were small clues, easily overlooked, but when viewed as part of a larger pattern, they suggested someone accustomed to managing both public appearances and private impulses with precision. And then came the financial clues that shocked even seasoned investigators. Nick had been making discrete payments, some to unfamiliar accounts, some in cash. There were withdrawals large enough to raise eyebrows, yet structured to avoid immediate detection. Some analysts speculated these could have been attempts to manipulate assets, or perhaps even bribes or hush payments. The exact purpose was unclear, but what was clear was a pattern of planning and secrecy that no one in the family had noticed until it was too late. Even his interactions with Romy were layered with contradictions. On one hand, he displayed care, checking in occasionally, maintaining the appearance of a loving brother. On the other hand, subtle manipulations and resentments were apparent in private conversations. Investigators, analyzing his behavior after the fact, suggested that he may have been building psychological distance from his sister, further isolating himself and preparing the ground for what was to come. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the extent to which Nick had concealed his planning from those closest to him. He had access to the estate, knowledge of schedules, and awareness of when his parents would be most vulnerable. The precision of the crime suggested a level of foresight that was terrifying in its clarity. The quiet, polite young man was now revealed as someone capable of calculated violence, a chilling contrast that gripped everyone involved. Even his digital footprint revealed contradictions. Publicly, Nick was unremarkable, blending in with friends and neighbors. Privately, he had searches, communications, and online activity that suggested a mind preoccupied with control, strategy, and secrecy. Some of these activities, investigators would later say, hinted at premeditation, or at least an awareness of the potential consequences of his actions. It was a pattern of hidden life carefully maintained, a dual existence that no one had fully perceived. Friends and neighbors who came forward described moments that, in hindsight, were warning signs. odd behavior at social gatherings, subtle irritability when discussing family matters, a sense of detachment from people he should have been close to. All these details began to coalesce into a portrait of someone whose private life was dramatically different from public perception. It wasn't just secrecy. It was planning, calculation, and, as investigators would argue, intention. Psychologists later analyzed Nick's behaviors, identifying patterns consistent with isolation, suppressed anger, and subtle manipulative tendencies. They suggested that the combination of resentment toward his parents, perceived injustices, and financial frustrations could have contributed to a mindset capable of violence. While this analysis could never fully explain the crime, it provided context, helping investigators, and later the public, understand how someone so seemingly ordinary could commit such extraordinary violence. And yet, for all the investigation, for all the forensic and psychological analysis, one truth remained. The full story could only come from Nick himself. The world, the media, and even his own family waited for him to speak, to finally admit what had happened and why. Every discovery, every revelation, every contradiction pointed to a single fact. Nick had been living a life hidden from view, and in that hidden life were the keys to understanding the tragedy that had engulfed the Reiner family. Have you ever noticed something off about someone you love, but ignored it because you didn't want to believe it? That's exactly the dilemma Romy Reiner faced in the aftermath of discovering her parents' bodies. The horror of the moment was compounded by a gnawing, almost unbearable suspicion, one that she had whispered to herself in fleeting moments over the past months. Could her own brother, Nick, have been capable of this? Could he really be the dangerous family member she had feared? As investigators examined the Brentwood estate, they began piecing together small but critical details that raised the first suspicions. Forensic evidence placed Nick at the scene, but that was just the beginning. The real clues came from behavioral patterns, statements, and digital footprints. A timeline was slowly being reconstructed, highlighting inconsistencies in Nick's story, gaps in his alibi, and actions that suggested more than mere coincidence. Romy's statements were pivotal. She told police about conversations she had overheard between her parents and Nick in the weeks prior, about arguments that seemed petty at the time but now appeared ominous. "I remember Mom and Dad discussing finances," she recalled. "Nick was quiet, but I could feel the tension in the room. I thought it was normal sibling rivalry. I wish I had paid more attention." Every small detail now carried weight. Every ignored warning sign was a potential thread to the truth. Neighbors began recounting moments they had dismissed. Nick had been seen leaving the property at odd hours. He sometimes seemed anxious when asked about his parents' schedule or whereabouts. On social media, he maintained a polite, even charming demeanor, but behind closed doors, he displayed irritability, frustration, and secrecy. To outsiders, he seemed harmless. But investigators began seeing a pattern. Isolation, meticulous planning, and subtle aggression that aligned too closely with the timing and method of the murders. Financial anomalies added fuel to the suspicions. Nick had been moving money in ways that were unusual for someone his age and circumstance. Transfers, withdrawals, and account activity suggested preparation, control, and perhaps a level of calculation that made authorities increasingly uneasy. Combined with behavioral evidence, it was enough to intensify their focus. Nick wasn't just a person at the scene. He was central to the puzzle. As the public watched, the first rumors began to circulate. Was Nick truly capable of murdering his own parents? Commentators debated his motives, from financial gain to unresolved anger. Social media exploded with speculation, wild theories, and hot takes. But the truth, investigators knew, lay in careful observation, documentation, and psychological analysis. They could not rely on speculation alone. They needed evidence, corroboration, and behavioral insight. The investigators also focused on patterns in communication. Text messages, emails, and social media interactions revealed small tensions that had gone unnoticed. Arguments over money, small grievances about attention or privilege, and messages expressing frustration all pointed to simmering resentment. These were not dramatic confessions or violent threats. They were ordinary, human expressions of frustration. But when seen in the context of the murders, they took on a far more sinister meaning. Detectives interviewed friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, trying to piece together Nick's mindset. They uncovered subtle contradictions. A young man who appeared polite and reserved publicly, yet privately struggled with anger, frustration, and a desire for control. He had cultivated a sense of invisibility, keeping his deeper thoughts hidden even from those closest to him. The duality was striking, and investigators began to see that understanding Nick's hidden life was key to understanding the murders themselves. Even within the family, tension had been growing for years. Romy recalled small, almost trivial moments that now seemed like ominous warnings. Arguments about chores, responsibilities, or finances, things that would normally pass unnoticed, were now reframed in the light of tragedy. It was as if the entire family had been walking on a fault line, unaware of the tremors beneath their feet, until the quake hit. Authorities began to establish a timeline, using every tool available: surveillance footage, digital activity, witness statements, and behavioral analysis. Each piece of evidence seemed to point to a single truth. Nick had not only been present, but he had opportunity, knowledge, and motive. The case was shifting from a horrific mystery to a chilling portrait of premeditation. What made the suspicions even more compelling was the contradiction in Nick's behavior. On one hand, he maintained the appearance of normalcy, polite interactions, friendly demeanor, and engagement in ordinary activities. On the other hand, the investigators uncovered subtle signs of agitation, secrecy, and manipulation. The contrast between public appearance and private behavior was stark, a hallmark, authorities would later suggest, of someone capable of hiding violent intentions until the moment was right. Romy's observations were critical. She noticed, in retrospect, small things she had previously dismissed: Nick's avoidance of certain topics, his evasiveness when asked about money, and the subtle frustration he displayed toward his parents' attention to her. These minor details, viewed in isolation, seemed trivial, but investigators pieced them together, forming a narrative of resentment, tension, and isolation that culminated in tragedy. The first suspicions weren't limited to behavioral evidence. Forensic findings, though preliminary, provided a scientific backbone to the case. Blood spatter patterns, the placement of objects, and the condition of the guest house suggested that the perpetrator knew the environment intimately. The attack was methodical, deliberate, and executed with knowledge of the family's routines. Investigators increasingly realized that the person they were seeking was not an outsider, but someone with intimate access and understanding. A family member, someone who had been overlooked in plain sight. Meanwhile, the public frenzy intensified. News outlets ran endless stories speculating about the family dynamic. Social media theorists debated every detail, from Nick's history to his relationship with Romy and his parents. Theories ranged from financial disputes to psychological breakdowns, each more sensational than the last. Yet investigators remained methodical, knowing that appearances could be deceiving. They focused on evidence, looking past the noise to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of normalcy and secrecy. Financial analysis revealed transactions that were irregular but subtle enough to avoid casual detection. Transfers, withdrawals, and purchases suggested planning, though the intent remained unclear. Combined with behavioral patterns, investigators began constructing a portrait of a young man who, while outwardly normal, harbored private frustrations and possibly intentions that would culminate in murder. Psychological experts analyzed Nick's interactions, identifying behaviors consistent with isolation, suppressed anger, and manipulative tendencies. While no single factor could explain the murders, the combination of environmental pressures, family tensions, and hidden resentment created a dangerous emotional landscape. Investigators began to see a clear trajectory, subtle signs, overlooked by family and friends, escalating into lethal action. And then there were the digital breadcrumbs. Messages, searches, and communications revealed moments of anger, secrecy, and planning. Nothing overtly incriminating at first glance, but when pieced together with forensic and behavioral evidence, they told a story of preparation. Nick's private life, carefully hidden, provided insight into his mindset in the days leading up to the murders. The first suspicions had now solidified into a focused investigation. Authorities had a primary suspect, a clear pattern of evidence, and a timeline that increasingly implicated Nick. Every behavioral anomaly, financial irregularity, and private interaction now pointed toward a single reality. The perpetrator was the person closest to the victims. Yet, even as the investigation tightened, questions remained. What was Nick thinking in those final moments before the murders? Was this an act of anger, of calculation, or a combination of both? Could any of this have been prevented? These questions haunted not just investigators, but Romy and the public alike. And as the world waited for answers, one fact became undeniable. The first suspicions were now confirmed by pattern, evidence, and witness testimony. The quiet, polite young man who had lived in the guest house had become the central figure in a tragedy that shocked the nation. What secrets can a house hold when the people who live in it are keeping their own hidden lives? That's the question investigators began asking as they meticulously examined the Brentwood estate, a sprawling $13.5 million mansion that was supposed to be a symbol of comfort, stability, and family legacy. But beneath the polished floors, manicured gardens, and elegant facades lay secrets that no one outside the family could have imagined, secrets that would shock even the most seasoned detectives. The mansion itself was impressive in every way. Wide hallways lined with art, grand staircases, rooms filled with sunlight, and security systems designed to protect. On the surface, it was the perfect home, a place of luxury and privacy. Yet investigators quickly realized that the grandeur of the estate did not prevent darkness from taking root within its walls. In fact, the size and complexity of the house may have made it easier for tensions to fester unnoticed. Rooms that had once been filled with laughter and family gatherings now bore silent witness to tragedy. Every corner was scrutinized. The master bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, and most critically, the guest house where Nick lived. Investigators noted that the guest house, seemingly separate and benign, was a hub of activity and secrecy. Its location on the property gave Nick both independence and proximity, a combination that would prove critical in understanding the sequence of events leading to the murders. The first thing that struck authorities was the subtle ways in which the house itself reflected family dynamics. Certain rooms had become arenas of tension. The parents' private quarters were meticulously maintained, reflecting control and routine. The common areas, once lively with conversation, now bore signs of neglect in some corners, as though underlying disagreements had shifted the focus from shared spaces to individual isolation. Investigators noted these patterns, recognizing them as clues to the fractured relationships that might have contributed to the tragedy. The estate was also full of financial indicators, hidden in plain sight. Luxury items, safes, and secure storage areas suggested a family accustomed to managing significant assets. Investigators began cataloging everything: jewelry, cash, important documents, and property deeds. The focus wasn't just on theft or material gain, but on understanding the pressures, disputes, and power dynamics within the household. Money, it seemed, had quietly become a source of tension that no one had wanted to confront directly. Security systems played a critical role in reconstructing the morning of December 14th. Cameras covering the main estate, gates, and driveway captured movements around the property. While most of the footage was routine, Nick leaving for a walk, deliveries arriving, occasional visits from staff, small anomalies drew attention. Timing discrepancies, unaccounted movements, and patterns of behavior suggested premeditation. Investigators began mapping these movements, realizing that the mansion itself held the story of how the tragedy unfolded. Even seemingly mundane areas revealed hidden truths. Closets, drawers, and personal spaces contained journals, notes, and personal communications that hinted at long-standing resentments. Investigators found that Nick had spent significant time organizing, moving, and hiding certain items in the guest house. While none of this explicitly proved guilt, it illustrated meticulous planning and a desire to control the environment around him. Every object, every rearrangement, told a story of someone methodically managing both perception and reality. The mansion also revealed subtle tensions in the family hierarchy. Certain rooms and possessions were clearly prioritized, indicating perceived favoritism or control. Family heirlooms, expensive furniture, and personal mementos were stored strategically, reflecting power and ownership within the household. Investigators noted that these indicators, when considered alongside behavioral patterns, suggested that disputes over perceived rights and privileges may have played a role in escalating family tensions. Hidden financial documents added another layer of intrigue. Files related to bank accounts, investments, and trusts were discovered, some of which had been partially concealed. Investigators began to piece together possible motives: control of assets, inheritance disputes, and secret arrangements that may have fueled resentment. While motive alone never proves guilt, it provided critical context for understanding why Nick may have been at odds with his parents and why the crime unfolded as it did. Even everyday items became pieces of the puzzle. Keys, access cards, and personal devices were cataloged, revealing patterns of access and timing. Investigators began reconstructing movements throughout the estate in the days leading up to the tragedy, uncovering behaviors that suggested premeditation. The mansion, in this sense, became both a stage and a witness, a silent recorder of events that no one outside the family could have fully appreciated. The guest house itself was particularly revealing. While modest compared to the main mansion, it was self-contained and allowed Nick independence. Investigators noted that the layout provided both privacy and proximity, enabling him to move undetected during critical moments. Items within the guest house, from personal documents to hidden messages, suggested that Nick had been managing his private life in a way that allowed him to maintain a facade while secretly cultivating resentment and perhaps planning action that would later prove catastrophic. Investigators also examined the interactions between the guest house and main mansion. How often did Nick cross paths with his parents? Were there moments of confrontation, negotiation, or conflict? Small details, like notes left on kitchen counters, reminders in shared spaces, and patterns of communication, all contributed to a deeper understanding of family dynamics. It became clear that the mansion was more than just a home. It was a map of relationships, power struggles, and subtle tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface. Family members and staff offered insight into the emotional climate of the mansion. Staff recalled small arguments that escalated quickly, moments of withdrawal, and subtle acts of defiance or frustration from Nick. Family friends noted tensions in conversations that seemed innocuous at the time, but now appeared significant. These observations, when paired with forensic and behavioral evidence, painted a picture of a home rife with hidden conflict, a home in which tragedy, while shocking, had underlying warning signs that were overlooked. Even more striking were the hidden messages and clues found in personal spaces. Investigators uncovered journals, letters, and notes that provided insight into Nick's state of mind. While they did not explicitly outline criminal intent, the tone of frustration, resentment, and secrecy was unmistakable. It became clear that Nick's private life was carefully curated, shielded from public view, and largely invisible even to those closest to him. The mansion had been his stage, his retreat, and, ultimately, the environment in which his actions would reach a horrifying conclusion. Financial documents hidden throughout the estate revealed an even more complicated picture. Transfers, withdrawals, and undisclosed accounts suggested planning and forethought. Investigators considered whether these financial elements were connected to motive, premeditation, or both. The mansion's layout and the careful organization of assets suggested that Nick had intimate knowledge of the family's financial workings, a knowledge that gave him both opportunity and advantage during the tragic events of that December morning. Security footage continued to provide insights. Investigators pieced together a timeline of Nick's movements within the estate in the days before the murders. Certain patterns of behavior, previously dismissed as mundane, now appeared calculated. Walks to the perimeter, monitoring of entrances, and interactions with staff all contributed to the narrative of someone aware, deliberate, and increasingly isolated. The mansion itself had become both stage and witness, silently recording every move, every subtle sign of preparation. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the mansion's secrets was how normal everything appeared. To a casual observer, it was simply a wealthy, successful family's home. Polished, pristine, and orderly. Yet beneath the surface, tension, secrets, and planning simmered. The contrast between appearance and reality, between a home of comfort and a setting for horror, was what made this tragedy so compelling and so shocking. The estate was more than a backdrop. It was a participant in the story. Each room, each hallway, each hidden corner provided clues, context, and insight. Investigators were piecing together not just the crime itself, but the family dynamics, resentments, and opportunities that had made it possible. Every discovery deepened the suspense, revealing layers of planning, secrecy, and hidden motives. And as the investigators uncovered more of the mansion's secrets, one fact became clear. The tragedy could not be fully understood without examining the private world Nick had created within the estate. Every hidden ledger, every secret note, every rearranged item contributed to a portrait of a man who had been living a parallel life, one that no one fully understood until now. What can a body reveal that no witness can? What truths lie in the silence of death, waiting to be uncovered? For Rob and Michelle Reiner, the answers came through a meticulous autopsy, a painstaking forensic investigation, and the keen eyes of experts trained to read the story that life could no longer tell. The results would not only confirm the brutal nature of their deaths, but also illuminate details that few expected and set the stage for the shocking revelations to come. The medical examiner's office was quiet, sterile, and methodical. Every surface gleamed under bright lights. Every instrument was precise, and every detail of the procedure was documented with meticulous care. The bodies of Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were examined for the first time in a controlled environment, free from the chaos and emotion of the Brentwood estate. And from the very beginning, the findings were chilling. The official cause of death was determined to be multiple sharp force injuries. Each wound was deliberate, precise, and inflicted with a level of intent that left no doubt. This was no accident. The manner of death was homicide, as investigators had suspected, but the autopsy revealed a timeline and a method that were both telling and horrifying. The injuries were consistent with close contact, suggesting the perpetrator had been physically present and intimately familiar with the victim's movements. Forensic experts began reconstructing the sequence of events. The placement and depth of wounds indicated a methodical approach, not a frenzied outburst of violence. There was intention in each strike, a terrifying awareness of anatomy and timing. Analysts noted the precision, the control, and the calculated effort, leading to the grim conclusion that this was an act executed with knowledge, practice, and a disturbingly cold determination. Every cut, puncture, and bruise told a story. Investigators could determine angles, force, and even handedness, details that helped reconstruct the crime scene in 3 dimensions. Each piece of evidence pointed not only to the brutality of the act, but also to the profile of the person capable of committing it. The autopsy painted a clear picture. Someone close to the victims, someone who knew them intimately, was responsible. In addition to the sharp force injuries, subtle clues in the bodies suggested premeditation. Defensive wounds were present but incomplete, as though the victims had attempted to resist but were overpowered by someone physically stronger or strategically prepared. The pattern indicated both surprise and control, a combination that made the forensic findings all the more damning. Forensic scientists also examined trace evidence. Hairs, fibers, and DNA samples were meticulously collected, analyzed, and cataloged. Every fragment could be a key, every microscopic clue a link in the chain of events. The results showed consistency with a family member's presence, reinforcing the suspicion that Nick Reiner, who lived in the guest house and had access to the estate, was at the center of the crime. The timeline of death became a focal point. Experts estimated that the murders occurred in the early hours of Sunday, December 14th, hours before Romy discovered the bodies. This timing suggested not just opportunity, but planning. Someone had waited, observed, and chosen the precise moment to act. It was no random act of violence. It was deliberate, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Blood spatter analysis further clarified the sequence. The patterns indicated multiple strikes delivered with precision and intent. Investigators could determine approximate positions, angles, and even relative motion of the victims and perpetrator. Each piece of this complex puzzle reinforced a narrative of premeditation. escalating the case from tragic to meticulously executed. Beyond the immediate physical evidence, investigators also analyzed environmental factors. The layout of the mansion, the placement of doors, windows, and escape routes, all were considered in relation to the autopsy findings. The integration of spatial awareness with forensic evidence allowed detectives to reconstruct the events of the morning in increasingly vivid detail, revealing not just what happened, but how it unfolded with chilling clarity. Psychologists consulted on the case examined the autopsy report with particular interest. They noted that the precision and deliberateness of the attacks indicated not only physical capability, but emotional detachment. The combination of anger, control, and premeditation suggested a mindset prepared to commit a violent act against loved ones, a frighteningly rare but not unheard of profile. Investigators cross-referenced the autopsy findings with physical evidence from the estate. Fingerprints, footprints, and trace DNA were compared with the wound's characteristics, reinforcing the link between perpetrator and victim. Every scientific detail built toward a compelling narrative. The person who committed this act was not just familiar with the estate, but intimately connected to the victims in ways that made the crime deeply personal. Even small details in the forensic report carried weight. Defensive wounds, inconsistencies in body positioning, and the sequence of injuries all suggested an escalation of tension. Experts posited that the attack began in one location and moved strategically, indicating a level of control and awareness that only someone with intimate knowledge of the household